Hi, Dr. Lamb here again with Week 8's lesson on assessment. The text talks about assessing in science class, and we basically have three types of assessment that we're looking at. Pre-assessment, which gives us an idea of what our students come to our classroom already knowing. It's also a good time to be able to identify any misconceptions that our students have about the science concepts that we're going to be introducing. Formative assessment, which is ongoing assessment that you have embedded in your lesson uh, throughout the class that you're currently teaching, and maybe throughout the whole unit that you might be working on. Just ongoing, it's continually telling you how your students are doing in learning what it is that you're trying to get them to learn. And finally, we have summative assessment, sometimes called post-assessment, that tells us what was it that our students did learn in this session. So pre-assessment, what do the students already know? We set this assessment up by looking at what they need to know for the lesson that you're going to be teaching. What kind of terms are you going to be using that you have to make sure your students are aware of? In TPA, we're going to be calling that academic language. For example, if you have a lesson where your objective is to get them to be able to analyze data, well, you need to make sure your students know what it means to analyze. So what kind of things do your students need to know for your lesson? And what kind of things are your students going to need to be able to do for the lesson? These are things that you can assess prior to the lesson to what level the students already understand. Formative assessment, as I said, is assessment that you are continuing to do ongoing throughout your lesson that gets you to understand, to keep abreast, to kind of follow the way your students are improving and understanding what it is that you're doing. So as you're planning this type of assessment, you're looking at what learning opportunities do you need to provide for your students that are going to allow them to meet the standard that you have set. And how do you know the students are getting it, are understanding and following along with what you're doing? What kind of adjustments do you need to do during your lesson? What kinds of things do you need to change, go back over, adapt to the needs of the student, either in the current lesson that you're working on or in tomorrow's lesson? So that formative assessment is actually taking place during the lesson that you're teaching and helping you to prepare for what you're going to do next. Sometimes making changes even right there during the lesson, having to adjust what you're doing. Summative assessment, what my students learn. When you are planning this kind of assessment, you're designing an assessment that's going to tell you if your students understood what it was that you were trying to get across in your lesson. So as you design that, you have to think about, well, if I met the objective, what kind of things would my students have to be able to do or be able to write or say if they understood that standard? If they learned that standard, what would they be able to do? And how could I be confident that indeed they did meet that standard? So you're basically looking at the understanding how effective your lesson design was. As your author talks about on page 256, one way to accomplish this is backwards planning. You know what your objective is that you're going to teach. Typically, that is given to you by your district. In this example, it's going to be given to you by your cooperating field teacher. So you know the objective. You know what you want your students to learn. So now you need to decide, how are you going to know that they have learned it? What is it you're going to ask them to do at the end of the lesson that's going to give you the information to help you feel confident that they did indeed learn that? So as you think about designing that assessment, then you looking at your assessment say, okay, this is what I want them to be able to do. Well, what kinds of assignments then, what things could you do in the lesson that's going to lead them to be able to be successful on that assessment that you're planning for them? So if I'm going to do a laboratory assessment where I'm going to ask this kids to actually perform an experiment as the result, as the formative final, as the summative assessment in my lesson, and I'm going to have them design an experiment where they are going to test the strength of a motor by lifting washers and using a force measure, using a stopwatch, using a balance to find the mass. Any of those things that I'm going to incorporate into that assessment, I've got to make sure on the front end in the lesson that they have opportunities to use those skills if I'm going to be testing them on those skills, if I'm going to be assessing them on those skills. And that's much more directive if you do it with the assessment in mind than the other way around, that you plan out this lesson you want to do and you have all these things that you decide to do. Then you're going to choose an assessment. Then you have to kind of look back and say, okay, well, what was I doing with them? And if I want to test them this way, I've got to make sure that I had done that. And so it can be much more confusing. It's a little cleaner and by planning your assessment up front.